Welcome again to Intuitive Reactions, the MENA and Gulf regions and way beyond, number 41. In part A, which is roughly 10 minutes, just under 10 minutes, I set the scene for what is happening in Ukraine and in the Ukraine-Russia war today. In part B, this one, I will continue a little bit further, probe a bit deeper perhaps, and suggest some thoughts as well. So do bear with me, and I hope you will find both of them together as being a meaningful contribution to what is happening today in that part of the world. Now, the war has had consequences on a lot of the actors. Take the European Union, the 27. This war is spawning, in my opinion, an independent military force in Europe that is less dependent on the United States, something that France's Emmanuel Macron has been saying for quite a while. And it now also subscribes with the German attitude, since Chancellor Olaf Scholz has pretty much overturned a lot of the approaches by his predecessor, Angela Merkel, and is now increasing expenditure, being much more military-minded and sending weapons to Ukraine as well. So in a sense, we're seeing a change within the European Union, and this was noticeable, I think, during the EU summit in Versailles in Paris. And interestingly enough, the corridors of communication that have somewhat improved between the EU and our own post-Brexit UK, despite the fact that we have perhaps different orientations and different guidelines in our own foreign policy. Another impact of this war is on the MENA and Gulf region, because it has also shown the hesitation, the fears and the weaknesses of those countries there. I'm of course not only talking about food. Yes, Egypt, Yemen, Lebanon, others have already mentioned time and again about how this war is having an impact on food supplies, and we already see some bakeries and some getting a little bit nervous about where we're heading with this. But it's far more than that. It also has to do with relations between the MENA and Gulf region and the United States as well as Europe. Particularly at this stage, I would say, between the United States on the one hand and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates on the other. The tensions there are palpable. They have been made manifest. I've touched upon them in previous couple of YouTubes on this war as well. And I think at the moment when America, the Biden administration, as well as Europe, are basically saying that we are going to sanction all oil and gas imports from Russia, then of course it becomes quite normal for people to think, so who's going to make up the difference? Will it be OPEC or OPEC plus? Will it be, as we have been witnessing, perhaps even Venezuela with President Maduro coming back into the limelight? This is also very, very interesting. And I would suggest that you listen to a podcast by the Arab Voice, the New Arab Voice. It's produced by Hugo Goodridge and Rosie McCabe. I will put it in the description box. It just came out a couple of days ago, and it actually addresses the impact of this war on the MENA and Gulf regions. I think it's definitely worth a listen. It's about 37 minutes long. The third one is, of course, the US-NATO Russia confrontation. And here also there have been many, many voices which have questioned the way this confrontation is going, whether the West, and by the West I mean North America and Europe, Western Europe in general, could actually take the high position and say, oh, this is all Russia's fault, that the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, is irrational, he is isolated, he doesn't know what he's doing, or that he's got pyromaniacal and destructive tendencies. Interesting, I think, for you to look at this from a slightly different perspective as well, because the tensions between Russia and NATO, which are manifest in many different ways, could be very dangerous in the medium term. And for that, the second link I'm going to include in the description box is an opinion piece by Professor Hamid Dabashi of Columbia University in New York, where he talks about the excesses of the United States, where he lives, those of Russia, and he then looks at both through the prism of one of the literary giants who actually straddles the Ukraine-Russia divide, Nikolai Gogol. Have a read, it's only a few minutes long, and I think it's got some very nice ideas in there as well. Then, of course, we have the JCPOA. Now, all information coming out of Vienna indicates that the agreement is pretty much done and ready for signature, but that at the last minute, Russia has raised objections and it's put in more demands, probably as a result or as a consequence of the sanctions imposed by the West. Is it trying to safeguard its own interests? Is it trying to safeguard its interests vis-a-vis trade with Iran? Or is it just being obstructive? And finally, of course, in this context, there is China. There is China, which has basically sat on the wall and sort of, yes, supporting Russia, but at the same time not fully supporting Russia, because China has huge trade links with the European Union and also with Ukraine. But China and QAnon, yes, the famous QAnon that reminds you of Trump days, are embracing Russian disinformation quite eagerly to justify the war in Ukraine. They are saying that the claims made by the Russian ambassador at the United Nations Security Council that the US was developing deadly pathogens, in other words, biological weapons in Ukraine, is quite true. That is both worrying, and it also shows the levels of disinformation that people would go to. And guess what? As all this happens, and as happens often in situations of war and tension, there is a ground swell of polarization. The result, you talk to somebody who has views, and if you're not with that person's views, then you are against that person's views. For me, a very weird mentality that not only decries free thought, but that goes against everything we're supposedly fighting by supporting Ukraine in its war with Russia. Now, President Zelensky himself has become quite a phenomenon. His communication skills are really great. And he's said a lot of things. He's talked about NATO, he's talked about the European Union, he's talked about no-fly zones, he's talked about those MiG-29s coming from Poland to Ukraine via Germany. All this, and they have been countered by a stolid, Putin-esque Russian attitude of win come what may, because we're seeing what's happening. The infrastructure of Ukraine is already being damaged, if not destroyed, in some places like Mariupol, in order to cow the people of Ukraine to submit to the demands of Russia. Might is right, is what pretty much President Putin believes. And we have to be fair and say that what he's doing is a product of some concerns he has, plus his own imperial designs and dreams about where Russia should be today, rather than where it really is, both in military and economic terms. Hence, why he still maintains, and Russia still maintains, on calling this violent war a military special operation. So, having thrown these points for your consideration, for you to mull over, let me go back to Aristotle and sort of shake the apple cart a bit there too. Now, take the rhetorical triangle I talked about in part A of my YouTube. In an ideal world, the three sides of the triangle, the ethos, the logos, and the pathos, should be equal. That brings a balance in anybody's reasoning, thought, and speech. But in this case, the three sides are not equal, and they cannot be equal. However, given the looming perils ahead, should we not, and when I say should we, who are we? Not me and you necessarily, but politicians and perhaps even journalists and analysts, perhaps we should try to ramp up the logos a bit and ramp down the pathos. Because by intensifying the emotional expressions, we could also make this war more dangerous. And I'll link this with something so you don't say that I'm talking nonsense. I was deeply moved by a conversation today, just today, earlier this morning, Sunday, between our own Sir Michael Palin with a long-time Ukrainian friend of his, Vadim Castelli, who actually lives in one of the suburbs of Kyiv. They both appeared on Sophie Raworth's Sunday morning program on BBC One. When I say they both appeared, Sir Michael Palin was in the room with Sophie, and Vadim was talking to them via virtual Skype or Zoom or whatever. This friend, Vadim, talked about the reality in Ukraine today. And he added, and I paraphrase, because I really liked the man. And I thought, here is a man, a Ukrainian, who is talking sense. He is talking about logos without necessarily forgetting ethos and pathos. He said, I understand that NATO will not impose or cannot impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine. He said, I also can understand that the West cannot stop buying Russian oil and gas completely. But he said, the West, and by that he means America and Europe, but the West can help us with more arms in order to fight and fend off this aggression, and it can also help us with the refugee situation. And he added something which was quite interesting as well, because of what the Russian narrative has been about denazifying Ukraine and getting rid of those nationalists who are in control of all the violence and the wreck that is becoming this war. He added, we Ukrainians, Vadim said, we are nationalists, all of us, because we are national in our beliefs in our country. And therefore, we defend our nation. Nationalist, national nation. And that is why Putin hates us, he said. Now, for many of you, you would say, oh, this is even sub 101, Harry. Perhaps, but not everybody has linked those three words together to show that nationalist is not always a nasty word. So let us today, in conclusion, remember that this war, like many other wars, some of which I've witnessed personally, this is not an Atari war game. This is not an app that you download and then you sit and try and see how many planes or choppers you bring down or how many people you kill. This is real. And it is happening in our continent, which happens to be part of this planet. So remember, perhaps the higher up we all climb a tree, the more difficult it will become to climb down again. And when we do this, I really, really hope that we accept some Socratic counsel and we examine our own motivations and actions, as well as those of our adversaries. We are living in difficult times, in dangerous times, I believe. And so the world holds its breath. Have a nice, restful Sunday if you can.